Hello, and thank you for viewing this video presentation as part of the online statutory public open house for the City of Cornwall Comprehensive Zoning Bylaw Review to present the second draft zoning bylaw. My name is Anita Sott, and I am part of the WSP consulting team assisting the City in completing the review and preparing a new comprehensive zoning bylaw. To date, an in-person public open house was held in February 2020 to introduce the project. A second online public open house was held in May 2020 to present a discussion paper on various zoning issues to be addressed through the zoning bylaw review. A zoning strategy report with recommendations for the new zoning bylaw was also prepared and presented to the City's Planning Advisory Committee in September 2020. A third online public open house was held in February 2021 to present the first draft zoning bylaw. All of these previous reports and open house materials are available for review on the City's website at www.cornwall.ca/zoning review. This video presentation walks through the key changes in the second draft zoning bylaw and zoning map. Once you have finished watching or listening to the video, please visit the City's website to review the second draft zoning bylaw document and zoning map, as well as the public open house display boards. This slide provides an outline of this video presentation. We will provide an overview of the second draft zoning bylaw document and zoning map, and how to navigate them to find zoning information for your property. We will then discuss key changes made in the second draft zoning bylaw. Lastly, we will explain how you can share your input with the City on the second draft zoning bylaw, what the immediate next steps are in the process, and how you can stay involved. For introductory information on the comprehensive zoning bylaw review process and why the City is reviewing their existing zoning bylaw, which dates back to 1969, please visit the City's website. The second draft zoning bylaw has been prepared based on comments received on the first draft zoning bylaw from City staff, the Planning Advisory Committee, the Technical Advisory Committee for the project, and members of the public through written comments and feedback obtained through the online public open house number 3 held in February 2021. The second draft zoning bylaw document is made up of 5 main sections. Section 1, Administration and Interpretation, describes how the zoning bylaw is implemented by the City. It contains information on how the zoning bylaw provisions and zoning map should be read and interpreted. Section 2, Definitions, contains definitions for permitted uses and other key terms used in the zoning bylaw. It also includes illustrations to help clarify certain definitions. Section 3, General Provisions, contains provisions that may apply to all properties in all zones, depending on the proposed development. For example, these include provisions related to accessory buildings, as well as parking requirements. Sections 4 to 29 contain provisions for the individual zones that make up the City. There are 26 different zones organized by land use types. For example, residential, commercial, employment, and open space. Each zone has its own section in the zoning bylaw, which establishes permitted uses, zone standards such as minimum lot area, setbacks, and maximum building heights, additional provisions such as special provisions for specific uses in that zone, and exception zones, which contain provisions that only apply to specific properties. Section 30 of the zoning bylaw introduces the zoning map, which illustrates the proposed zoning for all properties in the City. Zone boundaries are outlined in red on the zoning map. The legend lists the zone acronyms used on the map. For example, Res 10 means the Residential 10 zone, and GC means the General Commercial zone. All property owners are encouraged to review the proposed zoning for their properties, as some properties may have been rezoned in consultation with City staff, or may simply have had their zone name changed. Once the zoning bylaw and zoning map have been finalized and approved by Council at the end of the zoning bylaw review process, the zoning map will be converted to an interactive map on the city's website and will replace the mapping which is currently available on Cornwall maps. The next slides explain how to use the new zoning bylaw to determine what zoning provisions apply to your property. Step 1 is to find your property on the second draft zoning map and use the legend to determine what zone your property is in. Step 2 is to go to the zone section in the zoning bylaw document to find what provisions apply to your property and a potential development. For example, if the zoning map shows your property is located in the residential 10 zone, this means you should go to section 4 of the zoning bylaw document to find the provisions which apply to all properties zoned residential 10. These provisions will tell you what uses are permitted and what the zone standards are for development, such as minimum lot area, required building setbacks, and maximum building height. Step 3 is to use Section 2 definitions in the zoning bylaw document to help clarify the meaning of a permitted use listed in your zone or other zoning terms if you are not sure what they mean. For example, if your zone requires a certain side yard setback, you can consult the definitions to understand what a side yard is and where it is located on your lot in relation to a building and other required yards. Step 4 is to review the entirety of Section 3 general provisions in the zoning bylaw document to determine if any other provisions apply to your proposed development. For example, you may need to confirm how many parking spaces must be provided, or where an accessory structure, like a shed or a detached garage, is permitted on your lot. The next few slides describe key changes that have been made in the second draft zoning bylaw. However, for all changes made, the full second draft zoning bylaw and zoning map should be reviewed. For ease of review and comparison, key changes and revisions from the first draft zoning bylaw are shown in the second draft zoning bylaw document in two ways. Additions are highlighted in blue, and deletions are shown in red with a strike through, as shown in the example on the slide. The format in which the individual zones are presented is the same as in the first draft zoning bylaw. As the city's current zoning bylaw dates back to 1969, there have been many amendments made over the years which have resulted in the need for better organization of the document and zoning provisions. As shown in number 1, the sections of the zoning bylaw are color-coded with alternating blue and green headers and identify the section title in the top right corner. Each zone also includes a zone icon. As shown in number 2, each zone section begins with a preamble, which explains the intent of the zone and its relationship to the city's official plan land use designations, and what types of development are generally permitted. As shown in number 3, permitted uses have been organized in a bulleted list in alphabetical order. The terms used to describe permitted uses have been simplified. As shown in number 4, zone standards for development have been organized in tables, and metric measurements are used consistently. Lastly, site-specific exceptions, which only apply to specific properties, have been added to the second draft zoning bylaw and are organized in a section under each zone. Each site-specific exception is also numbered on the zoning map, with the zone acronym, a dash, and an assigned number, as shown in the red box on the slide. This ensures that property owners can easily identify that their property has an exception and where related provisions can be found in the zoning bylaw document. Some existing exceptions, which are in the city's current zoning bylaw, have been deleted. For example, if they are outdated or if the property has been built out according to the exception provisions. All property owners with site-specific exceptions in the city's current zoning bylaw should carefully review the exception zones and contact city staff with any questions or concerns. Site-specific exceptions which have a holding zone are identified with an H in brackets, as shown in the red box on the slide. A holding zone means that certain holding provisions must be satisfied, and the bylaw must be amended to remove the holding zone prior to development taking place. Section 1.12.4 of the second draft zoning bylaw provides more general information and provisions on holding zones. Section 2 definitions in the second draft zoning bylaw document has been revised to add new definitions which correspond to new permitted uses or new general provisions, or to clarify some definitions included in the first draft zoning bylaw. For example, a new definition for angular planes has been added, as there are new general provisions associated with the concept of angular planes as they apply to maximum building heights in some zones. These provisions will be further explained later in the presentation. Every permitted use listed under the zones has a corresponding definition. Similar permitted uses have been grouped under a single term. For example, different types of stores and shops permitted in the current zoning bylaw are now simply referred to as retail stores. Some definitions have illustrations to assist in understanding their meaning. For example, the definitions include explanations and illustrations of different dwelling types, such as a duplex dwelling, as shown on the slide. Based on comments from the Raisin Region Conservation Authority, new general provisions have been added in Section 3.1.1 to guide the development of boathouses as an accessory use on waterfront properties. The proposed provisions prohibit human habitation in a boathouse and regulate the maximum number of boathouses on a lot, the location of a boathouse in proximity to an adjacent lot, as well as maximum height, length, and gross ground floor area. Based on discussions with city planning staff, requirements related to angular planes have been reintroduced in the second draft zoning bylaw. The application of angular planes is currently required in some zones in the city's existing zoning bylaw. An angular plane is a conceptual line that projects across a lot at an angle measured horizontally from a lot line. The concept is used to regulate maximum building height for taller buildings. Several zones have been revised to permit 30-meter maximum building heights, subject to angular planes. For example, angular planes would apply to an apartment dwelling in a residential 40 zone or to an office building in the mixed-use commercial zone. Where zone standards prescribe maximum building heights subject to angular planes, the building must be located within the required angular plane and may be set back, stepped back, or terraced to fit in this area. As shown in the image on the left on the slide, in the case of a lot line which abuts a street, the angular plane would be measured at a 60-degree angle from the center line of the abutting street. As shown in the image on the right on the slide, in the case of a lot line which abuts a lot occupied by a residential building that is 13.5 meters in height or less, the angular plane would be measured at a 60-degree angle from the lot line abutting the adjacent residential building. These provisions ensure that adequate transition is provided between taller buildings permitted in a zone and the street or an adjacent low-rise residential use. Based on discussions with city staff, a new series of general provisions have been introduced in Section 3.28 to guide the development of small-scale urban horticulture uses. This involves the use of land on a limited scale for the indoor and/or outdoor cultivation and harvesting of fruit, vegetables, edible plants, honey, and mushrooms for commercial sale. The use is proposed to be permitted in the highway commercial zone and in all employment zones, and limited to lots with a maximum lot area of 0.8 hectares. Limited on-site retail sales of products made on site would also be permitted. Several general provisions regarding parking requirements have been revised in consultation with city staff, and primarily to help clarify provisions for residents and developers. For example, in Section 3.20.2, provisions have been updated to clarify how to calculate the maximum permitted size of a driveway for dwellings which have 1 to 4 dwelling units. A maximum of 40% of the entire front yard can be occupied by a driveway, and if there is an attached garage which projects in front of the main dwelling, the interior yard next to the garage can also be used in the calculation, as illustrated in the diagram on the slide which has been added to the bylaw. Continuing with parking, some minimum parking space rates have been revised for certain uses. For example, for home occupations, the bylaw has been updated to clarify that 1 parking space is required where clients or customers are served on site. In addition, if there is a non-resident employee working at that home occupation, a separate parking space would be required for that employee, which can be provided as tandem or back-to-back parking. The minimum parking space rate for restaurants has been revised to address instances in the city where an overabundance of surface parking has been required for these uses. A new parking space rate has also been introduced for small-scale urban horticulture to accompany those new provisions. Barrier-free or accessible parking space requirements have also been revised to better align with the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act, to differentiate between Type A, or van-accessible parking spaces, and Type B parking spaces, which are narrower but still require a 1.5-meter access aisle. The provisions now provide direction on how many spaces of each type are required, depending on the total number of barrier-free spaces required on a lot. Moving on to key changes under the individual zones, the second draft zoning bylaw continues to contain 26 zones, as did the first draft zoning bylaw. For comparison, the city's current zoning bylaw number 751-1969 contains 32 zones. Some zone acronyms have changed from the first draft to the second draft zoning bylaw. The proposed employment zones have been revised to 3 zones called Employment Area Light, General, and Heavy. The previously proposed Employment Area Service has been combined with the Employment Area Light Zone, and a new Employment Area Heavy Zone has been introduced. Although no properties have currently been assigned the Employment Area Heavy Zone, city staff are currently in the process of reviewing which properties should be zoned heavy in line with their current operations and nature of use. In some zones, permitted uses have been revised based on discussions with city staff. For example, a hospice has been added as a permitted use wherever a hospital is permitted, and daycare centers are now permitted in all residential zones. In the residential zones, certain lot standards have been revised for consistency and based on feedback from city staff and the development community. Zone standards for maximum lot occupancy and landscaping requirements are now consistent across all zones where triplexes, quadruplexes, and apartment dwellings are permitted. Minimum rear yard setbacks for residential uses, including row houses, triplexes, quadruplexes, and apartment dwellings, have been revised to 8 meters across all zones. Minimum interior side yard setbacks for single detached, semi-detached, and duplex dwellings have been clarified to explain the different setbacks required, depending on whether the dwelling has a carport, a detached garage, or an attached garage with or without living space above or behind the garage. An illustration has also been added to assist in interpreting the side yard provisions. As in the first draft zoning bylaw, each zone has been updated with a maximum building height standard for all permitted uses. A detailed review of proposed maximum building heights was undertaken with city staff, with consideration for comments previously received from the Planning Advisory Committee and from the public. Some zones now permit 30-meter maximum building heights for specific uses, and subject to the angular planes section of the bylaw, which was described earlier in this presentation. 30-meter maximum building heights, subject to angular planes, are proposed for apartment dwellings in the Residential 40, Central Business District, Le Village District, and mixed-use commercial zones. Non-residential uses in the Central Business District, Le Village District, and mixed-use commercial zones, and combined residential and non-residential uses in the mixed-use commercial zone. A last key change deals with floodplain boundaries in the city. A floodplain refers to the area, usually comprised of lowlands adjoining a watercourse, which has been or may be subject to flooding hazards. Development within the floodplain is regulated by the city's zoning bylaw and by the Raisin Region Conservation Authority. The concept of a floodplain overlay, as opposed to a zone, was being previously considered. However, it has been decided in coordination with city staff and the Conservation Authority that the city's existent environmental constraint floodplain zone should be maintained, and the boundaries of the zone as shown in the city's current zoning bylaw will stay the same. In the future, the boundaries of the zone will be reviewed by the city upon completion of a comprehensive watershed floodplain modeling and mapping study, which will be undertaken separate from the current zoning bylaw review project. This slide describes how to share your input on the second draft zoning bylaw at this stage of the zoning bylaw review. On the city's website at www.cornwall.ca/zoning review, you will find all previous background studies and public open house materials, and display boards that present the key changes in the second draft zoning bylaw, as described in this video presentation. If you have questions, comments, or suggestions for the zoning bylaw review, including about the proposed zoning for your property, you are encouraged to email the city at planning@cornwall.ca. Your email can be submitted in English or in French. A response will be provided in English or in French as required. This slide outlines the immediate next steps in the zoning bylaw review. At this time, the second draft zoning bylaw and zoning map have been prepared and made available on the city's project website as of Friday, August 6th. The second draft zoning bylaw and zoning map were presented to the city's Planning Advisory Committee on August 16, 2021 for information. This online statutory public open house will be available on the city's website from August 30th to September 10th. A final draft zoning bylaw and zoning map will then be prepared and will address any feedback received from the public through this open house. The final draft zoning bylaw and zoning map will be published on the city's website at least 20 days in advance of the statutory public meeting, anticipated to be held this fall 2021. At the statutory public meeting, members of the public will be able to make delegations to provide verbal comments on the zoning bylaw. Written comments may also be submitted. Following this, the zoning bylaw would be finalized and presented to Council for adoption by the end of 2021. This slide provides an overview of how you can stay involved in the city's zoning bylaw review process. You can visit the city's website at www.cornwall.ca/zoning review for regular project updates as the project moves forward, and to review engagement materials and reports as they become available. We encourage you to send your written questions and comments on the second draft zoning bylaw and zoning map to planning@cornwall.ca in English or in French. Future public engagement opportunities will be advertised on the project website, on the city's social media accounts, through newspaper notices, and in community bulletins at major city facilities. This final slide provides contact information. The city contact for the zoning bylaw review process is Mary C. Joyce Smith, Division Manager of Planning for the City of Cornwall. Mary can be reached using the project email. Calls may be directed to Ellie Daniels, Administrative Assistant, at 613-930-2787, extension 2328. Thank you for viewing this video presentation. and for your participation and valued input into the city's zoning bylaw review.